On April 13th, 2020, a faint object approached the inner solar system. At first, it was cataloged as a comet, nothing more than a frozen wanderer. But then the data shifted. Astronomers observed Atlas changing speed, bending its orbit in ways no comet should. A celestial body that should have obeyed the blind mathematics of gravity instead moved as if guided. For the first time in decades, the sky itself seemed to cut against its own laws. If an orbit can turn like a blade, what does that say about the hand that threw it? Before we continue, consider this. Truths hidden in plain sight are often the most dangerous. If you believe this mystery deserves to be seen, share it, because silence favors those who bury evidence. The official record says Atlas behaved like a comet, but comets do not perform corrections 3 times in a single approach. Instruments in Hawaii registered sudden deviations, each like a scalpel edge cutting across the calculations. For a moment, the sky betrayed its secrecy. What follows is not a claim, but a trail of anomalies. 6 hours of radar logs, erased. A gap in data where the orbit should have been continuous. Astronomers who spoke briefly, then fell quiet. Each silence adds weight, not clarity. Picture this orbit, not a drifting arc, but a knife thrust with intent. To the human eye, it may look like a smear of light across the telescope's lens. To physics, it looks like precision. And precision is never an accident. You are not asked to believe. You are asked to look at what was recorded, at what was erased, at what remains unexplained. A body moving as if commanded, a trajectory sharper than any natural path. If the heavens are a script, then this entry is no improvisation. It is a message, written in motion, sent across the void. And in that message, something speaks without words. On May 2nd, 2020, less than 3 weeks after the first orbital deviations were logged, a second anomaly surfaced. The chemistry. Spectrometers aimed at the dim coma around Atlas reported a ratio that should have been noise, yet kept repeating itself as the object brightened. 8 parts carbon dioxide to 1 part everything else that could be confidently identified. For a natural comet, that balance is uncommon. For an engineered release, it would be convenient. And the clock was already running toward a narrow observing window in late June, when Earth's geometry and weather allowed only a handful of clean nights to test the result again. If information like this matters to you, keep your attention here and pass the light onward. Complex puzzles rarely survive in the dark. They survive because people refuse to look away. The official explanations lean toward caution, as they should. Calibration errors, transient plumes, incomplete spectral libraries. A responsible scientist could offer all 3 in one sentence. But the data did not go away. Cross-checks from 2 additional sites returned the same pattern, with minor variations that could be blamed on instrument response. When teams subtracted background and compared the line strengths across wavelengths, the ratio persisted with a composure that felt less like chaos and more like arithmetic. 8-1. Not hydrogen, not oxygen, not the expected signature of frozen volatiles in the proportions taught in classrooms and reported in journals for decades. Carbon dioxide dominant, water and trace organics trailing behind. That is not a smoking gun. Sometimes space simply surprises us, but it is the kind of surprise that aligns too easily with an earthly conversation we have been having for years. How much greenhouse gas would it take to thicken the Martian sky? Simulations vary, but their headlines rhyme. On a cold world like Mars, carbon dioxide is the lever. You can argue how long the lever must be, how fast you can push, and what collateral chemistry will rise to resist you. Yet the first move in every serious plan remains the same. Accumulate heat by saturating the air with molecules that trap sunlight, then free additional gases locked in polar caps and soil. The objective is not to build Eden overnight. The objective is to nudge a dead atmosphere toward the edge of breath. Here's where the record grows uncomfortable. On May 18th, a small team presented a closed-door briefing to a European committee, comparing Atlas measurements with modeling work on rapid atmospheric forcing. The meeting minutes are public. The slides are not. The minutes mention unexpected alignment between observed abundances and several accelerated warming profiles tested for Mars. That phrase is careful and uncommitting. It also narrows the field of coincidence. The same week, a graduate student posted a preprint analyzing archival spectra of past interstellar visitors. The paper is still available, and its core point is simple. We have seen carbon dioxide in these objects before, but not in a sustained configuration at this level with this stability while the body approached a heliocentric distance, where sublimation should be predictable. The student was careful with language, using might and could like handrails on a steep stair. Even so, the work triggered a familiar response. Supportive comments appeared. Then, a thread in the discussion section vanished after a day, replaced by a placeholder that read, "Removed by moderator request." The sky does not care what we think, but men and institutions do. During the first clear night of the late June window, an amateur array in the Canary Islands captured a spectrum with a surprising clarity for consumer hardware, stacking hundreds of short exposures to reduce noise. Their posted graph echoed the 8-to-1 theme with an elegance that felt almost theatrical. Within 40 minutes, a correction appeared beneath it from a user with a new account, claiming the scale was mislabeled. Within an hour, the graph was gone, replaced by a blurred image that conveyed nothing except the promise that something once existed there. No single piece here can carry the burden of certainty. A ratio, by itself, is just a fraction, but a fraction can be a fingerprint, and fingerprints, when they repeat in unrelated rooms, point to a visitor who intends to be recognized without being named. When I overlay the chemistry against the calendar, a pattern emerges that neither proves nor dissolves anything. May brought the first clean detections. June brought the window. July brought weather that washed out observation for more than half the month across key latitudes. When clear nights returned, Atlas had rotated enough that the strongest lines fell into a glare overlay from solar activity, a bad luck coincidence that erased the very frequencies everyone needed to recheck. What remains visible is still sobering. Carbon dioxide in that proportion could, if deployed near Mars at the right altitude and velocity, initiate a chain of physical responses we already understand and outline. Polar cap sublimation, pressure increase, a shift in the frost line, and the release of additional gas currently locked in regolith and ice. Not a garden, not a miracle, but a push. Enough to move the needle from barren toward marginal, from silent toward the first whisper of weather. There is a counter-argument worth hearing. Carbon dioxide is common in comets, sometimes dominant. Yields vary with composition, temperature, and porosity. A single ratio observed at distance proves little about what lies under the skin of a tumbling object. That is true. It is also true that the lines we are reading come not from a single night, a single instrument, or a single algorithm. They come from a convergence that resisted the noise we expected and survived the excuses we were prepared to accept. On June 29th, a short internal memo circulated inside a North American laboratory, later quoted in a journalist's column. The memo advised teams to suspend public commentary until a consistent compositional framework is established. There's nothing nefarious in asking for discipline, but the phrasing chose its own fate. Within hours, the phrase consistent compositional framework was everywhere, detached from context and transformed into a symbol of caution or concealment depending on who repeated it. Meanwhile, the amateurs kept working. One group used narrowband filters to isolate the emission lines, sacrificing brightness for precision. Another group tried a different tactic, hunting not for the lines themselves, but for the thermal behavior they would imply. Their plan was audacious and imperfect. Measure the coma's temperature profile as Atlas crossed similar solar distances, looking for a match to the thermal curve that an outgassing dominated by carbon dioxide might draw. The results were messy, as fieldwork tends to be, yet the curve bent where the model said it might. The difference between nature and design remained a question. The difference between ordinary and remarkable did not. There's a temptation, when confronted with a pattern that suits our worries, to leap ahead to an author. Resist that leap. Replace the author with a more modest idea. Intent. Intent leaves marks even when authors remain invisible. In mechanics, intent looks like an orbit that behaves less like a thrown stone and more like a guided dart. In chemistry, intent looks like a blend that returns to the same ratio across changing conditions, like as if following a recipe rather than a thaw. What would a recipe like this be for? On Earth, carbon dioxide is framed as a problem or a tool depending on whether you are thinking about climate or agriculture. On Mars, it could be both. By thickening the air even slightly, a world opens to liquid, moments it has not seen in ages. By lifting dust and shaping seasonal flows, a world signals that it can be pushed, not just observed. Perhaps the recipe is nothing more than a coincidence of frozen history. Perhaps it is a test packet meant to see which systems respond. The difference lies not in the molecules, but in the motive. If intent exists, it hides in the timing. The period between late spring 2020 and the next major solar conjunction limited direct study, while later geometry placed Mars and Atlas in sympathetic positions that any modeler would recognize as favorable for transfer. I am not arguing for a plan. I am reading a calendar that could have been chosen by chance, yet lines up uncomfortably well with the kind of windows engineers try to use and observers struggle to keep. There's also the matter of silence. Silence is not proof, but it is a condition. During those same months, public channels fell quiet while internal meetings multiplied. Colleagues who once answered emails in hours took days. A draft paper that had circulated among peers was replaced by a shorter version, with softer phrasing and fewer plots. The content still mattered. The tone had changed. Words that once pressed forward now stepped back. An object can be many things at once. Atlas might be a relic of a system unlike ours, a chemistry lesson from a place where carbon dioxide is long-lived and abundant. Atlas might be a messenger from a time before our categories hardened into the comforts that keep us calm. Or Atlas might be a device whose behavior will only make sense when the pieces are placed in order months from now, at a distance we cannot change. The only honest position is the one that keeps counting. The ratio was measured. The ratio persisted. The ratio aligns with hypotheses that reach beyond tradition without abandoning physics. If that alignment stands through the next window, the question will not be whether carbon dioxide is present. The question will be why it insists on appearing like a signature rather than a smear. If amateurs can separate the signal from the fog with equipment that fits on a patio, why do the largest mirrors give us less? Maybe that is unfair. Ground truth is hard, and professionals work under rules that prevent premature claims. But listen to the pattern beating beneath the debate. It says, look again. It says, do not accept the blur as an answer when it can only ever be a placeholder. The sky will not explain itself on command. We have learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. Still, there are hours when the veil thins. On nights when the wind cooperates and the software behaves, you can hear the hiss of data turning into meaning. If those hours return and the ratio holds, then we will be obligated to ask the question that has paced this chapter like a shadow. Is Atlas simply a cold archive of carbon chemistry? Or could it be a carefully mixed note, tuned for a red world waiting for heat? The knife turned in Chapter 1. Here in Chapter 2, the recipe repeats. A path that looks guided, a blend that looks chosen, a silence that grows louder with each attempt to call it ordinary. The universe may be indifferent, but patterns are not. On June 4th, 2020, less than a month after Atlas revealed its unusual chemistry, the sky produced another anomaly. A faint but steady radio pulse, repeating every 3,600 seconds, exactly 1 hour, began appearing in data streams. At first, it looked like background noise, the kind of static that often plagues receivers, but the pattern did not fade. It returned again and again, like a heartbeat, pulsing from the void. Amateurs with far smaller antennas than the space agencies logged the same rhythm. In Santiago, a group of hobbyists captured a clean file and published it. The waveform was simple: rise, fall, pause. Then the silence filled with the same beat, as if the cosmos itself was tapping on a locked door. Within 48 hours, their forum shut down without explanation. If you believe patterns like this deserve daylight, do not let them sink into silence. Share what you hear, because silence always serves those who want truth buried. The official explanation came quickly. Instrument error, misaligned filters, harmonics from local interference. All plausible. Yet none could explain why the amateurs recorded the same pulse half a world away. The agencies labeled it noise. The amateurs called it a signal. Between those two words lies the abyss of trust. What makes this 1 hour rhythm unsettling is not just its precision, it is its echo in history. In Sumerian texts, the Shar was the cycle of a celestial visitor, counted as 3,600 years. Coincidence, perhaps? Or perhaps not, if coincidence repeats with such elegance. A modern frequency tied to an ancient number, bridging millennia without permission. One leaked log, captured before being deleted, contained a single unambiguous line. Signal, confirmed, source, atlas, trajectory. That line was later replaced by noise flagged, ignore. Which version should we believe? The one written first or the one corrected after silence fell? Imagine listening in a dark forest, hearing the same knock return again and again, measured and patient. Do you call it wind? Do you call it danger? Or do you admit that someone, or something, might be knocking from the other side? If amateurs can hear it louder than the world's largest arrays, then who is choosing what the world gets to hear? On July 11th, 2020, the debate surrounding Atlas reached a breaking point. By then, the anomalies were not whispers scattered in obscure logs. They were piling into a dossier that demanded an answer. The orbit had turned like a blade. The chemistry had repeated like a recipe. The radio beat had knocked like a hand on a locked door. And now came the question no one wanted to confront. If Atlas was truly a comet, why did it fail every test of what a comet should be? Comets are archives. They are the frozen memory of the solar system, carrying signatures of iron, nickel, silicates, pieces of the primordial dust that built worlds. Every major comet studied shows a fingerprint of those heavy elements. But Atlas did not. Across multiple instruments, across multiple observatories, the spectrum returned the same emptiness. Iron was absent. Nickel was absent. The fingerprint was smudged out as though erased by design. Consider this. In a crime scene, missing evidence is as telling as blood on the floor. If every comet bleeds the same metals, but this one does not, what exactly have we pulled into our field of vision? You may have heard the phrase whispered by professionals, volatile dominance. It means a body that is mostly ices, light gases, fragile compounds that shatter under heat. That explanation might soothe us, except the ratios did not match the catalog of any known volatile-dominated comet. The chemistry looked like an instrument, balanced, narrow, persistent, as if someone had written the recipe into its very skin. One anonymous scientist, speaking in confidence, left a phrase that has since circled the darker corners of research forums. Atlas is being steered. Not Atlas behaves strangely. Not Atlas is unpredictable, but steered. A word that implies intent. A word that suggests guidance. If you stand before a locked door and hear a knock, you might dismiss it once. You might call it coincidence twice. But when the knocking repeats, timed with precision, you must choose. Is the forest empty, or are you not alone? Atlas was not behaving like a relic of creation. It was behaving like an object with purpose. And if that is true, then everything we have been told about it being a simple comet is wrong. Entirely wrong. Truth never arrives neatly packaged. It hides in the anomalies, in the erased lines of data, in the silences that follow too quickly after leaks. What we have here is not the randomness of ice and dust, but the fingerprint of intent. Atlas is not a comet. It is a device. On August the 2nd, 2020, an interview was scheduled with one of the senior astronomers who had been tracking Atlas from the earliest days. He sat down in front of the camera, adjusted his glasses, and looked straight into the lens. For 12 seconds, he said nothing. Then he shifted his gaze to someone off-screen. The interview ended there. The footage was never aired, and the institution later claimed the scientist had withdrawn due to illness. Why does silence feel heavier than speech? Because silence is rarely neutral. It is chosen. In the following week, a high-resolution image of Atlas briefly surfaced on an academic data server. Clearer than anything NASA had released publicly, it showed a surface scarred not by random fractures, but by angles. Straight edges where nature prefers curves. The file was downloaded by a few, mirrored by fewer, and then vanished within 12 hours. The server administrator cited technical maintenance. When the image returned, it was a blur, smooth beyond recognition, with the NASA watermark missing. You might ask, why alter a watermark if the photo was genuine? Why remove a symbol of authenticity unless the photo itself had become dangerous? Colleagues began noticing a pattern. Researchers who once spoke openly in conferences now paused when Atlas came up, offering rehearsed lines. The data is inconclusive. We should wait for more analysis. This is not the right time for speculation. Their eyes betrayed them. Nervous glances, tightened jaws, the kind of look you give when you know more than you are allowed to say. Amateur astronomers noticed the silence too. They began comparing official releases with their own captures, only to find the professional images consistently poorer in clarity. That inversion, where billion-dollar telescopes gave less than backyard lenses, was the anomaly that sparked the loudest suspicion. And suspicion grew because silence does not erase curiosity. It multiplies it. Imagine looking into someone's eyes, expecting truth, and finding a wall instead. That is what the scientific community saw in its own reflection that summer. A wall of silence where knowledge should have flowed. The question is simple. If Atlas were truly ordinary, why would extraordinary measures be taken to hide it? On August 23rd, 2020, a file appeared, lived one day, then died without a trace. It was discovered by accident, the way truth often is, not because someone announced it, but because someone stumbled where they were not expected to look. The file name was plain to the point of carelessness, Atlas terraform.df, tucked in a subdirectory of an academic mirror that usually hosted telescope maintenance manuals and student theses. Its existence was strange enough. Its contents made it radioactive. The first person to open it later said the document was unremarkable in style, but unsettling in substance. Most of the pages were technical, a chain of equations and plots that would lull a casual reader into skimming. But the headings did the work words are meant to do. Radiative forcing profiles at Mars mean pressure. Plume dispersal modeling for CO2-rich outgassing. Boundary layer coupling under low gravity and thin atmosphere. This was not fantasy. This was engineering language written for people who design outcomes, not people who merely observe them. If materials like this matter to you, then keep your eyes on the page. When information breathes only for a day, the only antidote to silence is attention. The timestamp on the file said it had been uploaded at 02.14 UTC. By 03:05, a graduate student in Prague had shared the link in a private chat. By 03:40, a veteran hobbyist in Arizona had mirrored it to his cloud drive. By sunrise across the Atlantic, the document had been read by at least a few dozen people, none of whom knew whether they were looking at a draft proposal, a simulation exercise, or a forgery constructed to test their credulity. What persuaded them was not the rhetoric, but the internal consistency. The figures referenced data that had genuinely circulated in closed colloquia in May and June. The 8-to-1 carbon dioxide signature, the thermal behavior from narrowband observations, and the timing windows tied to Mars geometry later that year. The third page carried a small, dry sentence that concentrated the entire storm into 11 words. Optimal release altitude aligns with the current trajectory of Atlas. Not must, not will. Aligns. The cautious verb of someone who knows how to write in a world that punishes certainty. Even that restraint could not mask the intent implied by the graph beside it. A sloping ribbon that showed how a CO2-dominant plume could seed a chain of warming events across the Martian atmosphere, if delivered along a corridor that the object was already traveling. By noon, commentary began. Some readers argued the file had to be a scenario analysis, the kind of speculative modeling teams sometimes produce to test instruments and observation plans. Others said the math was too clean for a student project and too pointed for a routine white paper. The strongest claim came from a researcher who recognized a plot style used by a European lab. The axis labels, the color palette, the way the uncertainty bands were shaded. He would not name the lab. He did not need to. Those who had been in the rooms knew. At 1421 UTC, the hosting directory returned to 404. An hour later, the entire domain displayed a maintenance page. Routine updates, it said. Nothing to see here. Meanwhile, mirrors flickered. The link in Arizona died. The chat in Prague went silent. On a forum where amateurs usually exchanged calibration tips, a thread titled Terraform File appeared, gathered 30 replies in 20 minutes, and vanished a minute later. No explanation, just removal. One copy survived long enough to be examined more carefully, and it added a detail that turned skepticism into unease. Buried in the appendix was a reference to a compositional convergence table, a tidy grid comparing lines observed by 3 independent sites. The grid listed dates that matched our previous windows, and it included a footnote about a planned recheck that never happened because of weather. None of this proved authorship. All of it matched the world as we remember living it. When fabrication mirrors reality too precisely, we have to ask whether reality is being filtered rather than invented. Late in the afternoon, a screenshot began circulating. It showed the last page of the document, stamped with 2 words nobody wanted to see, top secret. In the corner, a crest that looked vaguely ecclesiastical, too ornate for a university, too embellished for a research consortium. Those who shared the image claimed the server that first hosted the file traced back to a block of addresses often used by institutions in Rome. Others countered that anyone could spoof an address. Both positions could be true. The address range might mean nothing. The stamp might be decorative theater. But the stamp did its job. It made readers feel they were trespassing. Within 24 hours, a counter-narrative settled in. A spokesperson for a European committee stated that no official document by that title had ever been circulated, and that no such modeling effort was under review. A separate lab issued a brief note reminding the community that students sometimes label draft class projects with overly dramatic titles, and that these should not be confused with formal research. It was a reasonable statement. It also sidestepped the question the file had actually raised. If this was a student project, why were the graphs echoing restricted meeting minutes? If this was a prank, why did it dovetail with data the public had not yet seen? There's a principle investigators keep close when evidence is scarce. Weigh the behavior around the thing as carefully as the thing itself. The behavior here told its own story: rapid takedowns, synchronized silences, apologies that clarified nothing, and a steady drum of reminders not to jump to conclusions, spoken in a tone that implied the conclusion had already been reached somewhere you were not invited to sit. That night, an amateur in Lisbon published a measured analysis of the PDF's equations, arguing that whether the file was official or not, the assumptions it used were within the mainstream of current planetary climate modeling. He compared the plume dynamics to classic work on Mars dust storms and traced the boundary layer math to a standard text. In other words, nothing in the skeleton was exotic. The strangeness lay in how the bones had been assembled to point at a living object with a known path. The post gathered quiet applause. 3 hours later, his domain redirected to a blank page. There was one more oddity. An internal memo at a North American lab, leaked days later, advised staff to avoid referencing any unauthorized frameworks concerning Atlas atmospheric effects in public channels. The memo emphasized that nothing had been proven and that unvetted documents should not drive public understanding. Such caution is wise. Yet the phrase unauthorized frameworks did what legalistic phrases often do. It granted the very status it denied. If there are frameworks, who authorized the ones we are allowed to discuss? And why are the disallowed ones often the only ones that match what we see? You might be tempted to dismiss this as a cycle of rumor, fueled by curiosity and the thrill of transgression. And perhaps parts of it are. We are fallible creatures, quick to connect dots that only rhyme. But listen to the pattern that repeats. A file appears. It aligns with measurements across different instruments and months. It is removed. The removal spawns statements that answer questions no one asked and leave the central questions untouched. This is not proof of design. It is proof of choreography. If a document is false, it should wither under scrutiny. It should be dissected, ridiculed, and left as a cautionary fossil. When a document instead is hurried into a grave, and the mourners are told there was never a body, you are right to ask why the shovels were already in the ground. What did Atlas terraform.pdf truly contain? Perhaps only a thought experiment born of restless minds. Perhaps a breadcrumb that pointed deliberately or accidentally toward an interpretation too heavy for public speech. Or perhaps it was the simplest possibility of all. A draft assembled by competent scientists who saw a pattern they were not yet permitted to name, written in language that balanced on the blade between possibility and accusation. The file is gone. The echoes remain. They echo in the timing of uploads and deletions, in the improbable harmony between the document's claims and the night sky's replies, and in the sudden bureaucratic precision that arrives whenever curiosity gets ahead of the approved script. You do not have to accept the document as gospel to accept what its disappearance teaches. Disappearance is action. Action implies motive. Motive begs the question we cannot escape. If the file was nothing, why did everything move to erase it? If the file was something, why were we not allowed to weigh it ourselves? The touchline lands where all the others have landed since this story began. Erasure is itself evidence, not of what the universe intends, but of what institutions fear. We continue because the pattern continues. A turning orbit, a repeating chemistry, a patient signal, and now a paper that breathed for a day. Each piece could be natural. Together they feel like a sentence climbing toward meaning. Whether that meaning will be admitted in daylight or forced into midnight is not for us to decide. Our task is simpler and perhaps harder. Keep watching. Keep reading. Keep the copies you are allowed to keep. On September 5th, 2020, the world's largest telescopes prepared for a crucial window. Atlas was moving into perihelion, rounding the sun where its true composition should have revealed itself in a blaze of sublimation and dust. Astronomers had been waiting for this moment because perihelion is when comets shed their secrets, Spectral lines sharpen, tails brighten, and data pours in like water through a breached dam. That is what was expected. What arrived instead was a blackout. For 6 days, the instruments that should have been flooded with information returned almost nothing. Light curves flatlined. The expected surge of outgassing was missing, or perhaps hidden. From Hawaii to Chile, observatories reported the same void. Atlas slipped behind the glare of the sun and simply vanished. You've seen comets flare before. Hale-Bopp in '97 lit up the skies like a banner. Even faint wanderers leave a fingerprint, a bright whisper across detectors. Atlas gave silence. And in that silence, suspicion multiplied. The Chilean observatory at Cerro Paranal was among the first to break the rhythm. On the second night of the blackout, a technician leaked a brief note to colleagues. Total blackout confirmed. Signal dropout inconsistent with solar interference. Screens that should have displayed faint but measurable scatter from dust instead showed static, the kind that feels manufactured, not natural. Within hours, the message was gone from their bulletin. An American lab issued a careful statement. Solar glare has temporarily obscured observational capacity. Data will resume post-conjunction. Yet those who read the internal logs said something different. One log line in particular kept surfacing. Telemetry gap, object persistence unverified. Persistence unverified. A phrase designed to avoid panic while admitting the obvious. For that week, no one could prove Atlas still existed. AV3 amateurs tried to fill the void. Using backyard rigs and consumer optics, they attempted to capture the faintest glimmers near the solar horizon. One team in southern Spain posted an overexposed frame that showed a thin smear, elongated, faintly rectangular. Not dust, not tail. Something geometric. The photo survived for 12 hours before the forum collapsed under a sudden wave of takedowns. The official explanation was copyright breach. Yet amateurs don't copyright the sky. So what happens when all the professional eyes look away at once, and the few independent ones are blurred or erased? In the absence of light, the mind seeks metaphors. Some called the blackout a curtain. Atlas pulled behind cosmic theater, leaving the audience restless. Others said it was more like a power outage, an engineered silence, not an astronomical one. Whatever you call it, the blackout became the most unsettling anomaly yet. Because comets brighten when they meet the sun. Atlas darkened. If this were mere accident, the silence might be explained by geometry. Yet observers noted that the timing of the gap was longer than orbital mechanics demanded. Simulations suggested the object should have reappeared on September 9th. It did not surface until the 12th. 3 days in which Atlas occupied no pixel, no chart, no radar log. 3 days erased from the sky. As a deeper unease followed. During the blackout, one archive file from NASA's database briefly carried the tag Atlas, object status unknown. Within hours, it was edited to Atlas, observational delay. Those two phrases tell very different stories. Unknown implies absence. Delay implies inconvenience. Which one was true? And which one do you think the public was meant to hear? Consider this. If Atlas were only a comet, a blackout would have been a scientific nuisance, not an existential question. Scientists would have shrugged, waited, resumed. But the way institutions reacted, the pulled logs, the vanished photos, the contradictory phrasing, made the blackout itself into evidence. Silence speaks loudest when it replaces data. Let me put it plainly. For 6 days in September 2020, humanity lost sight of the object we were told was harmless. And when it returned, it was not the same. But that is for the next chapter. For now, the darkness itself is the story, the absence, the refusal of the sky to answer. What does it mean when the heavens go silent? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. But in the long ledger of anomalies, an orbit that cuts like a knife, chemistry that reads like a recipe, signals that knock like a hand at the door, this blackout was the deepest silence yet. And silence, when it arrives at the peak of expectation, is not just a gap. It is a message. On September 12th, 2020, Atlas returned to the sky. After 6 days of nothing, no signals, no images, no confirmations, the object reemerged from behind the glare of the sun. But what came back was not what had disappeared. The body that re-entered our instrument's gaze carried new wounds. It was brighter, yes, but the brightness was uneven, fractured, as if a shell had cracked, and on its surface, amateur astronomers claimed they saw the impossible: angles. The first clear frame came from a telescope array in South America. The technicians expected the blurred signature of a dust cloud. Instead, the exposure revealed a distortion in the coma, a void where brightness should have been uniform. That void, when enhanced, resembled a cylindrical indentation running parallel to the object's axis. Nature prefers chaos, pits, fractures, unevenness. This was not chaos. This was geometry. If comets are archives of randomness, why did Atlas return with the scar of a blueprint? The anomaly did not remain hidden long. By September 14th, amateurs in Spain and New Zealand had posted stacked exposures that suggested the same feature: a linear depression, unnaturally straight, like the groove of a manufactured part. What startled the community was not only the detail, but the clarity. These were hobbyist images, shot with equipment that fits in a garage, and yet they showed sharper features than the official releases from billion-dollar observatories. A question echoed across forums: if amateurs can see this, why can't the agencies? And an even sharper one followed: or can they, but won't they show us? Durchsichtig. The comparison became damning. The amateur photos showed contrast, edges, the strange rectangular void, NASA's public release from Hubble that same week. A blurred smear, monochrome, unconvincing. The timing was too perfect, the difference too stark. Conspiracy or coincidence? The perception was sealed. The clearest photos were being hidden, while the clearest lies were being shown. One chilling post summarized the mood: we live in a world where backyards see clearer than space agencies. Ask yourself why. Inside the silence, a leak stirred. A short message circulated in encrypted chat groups, allegedly from an observatory employee. Reemergence confirmed, surface feature detected, internal term, docking scar. The phrase ignited speculation. Docking scar? As if something had once attached itself to Atlas and left behind the mark. As if the blackout was not absence, but activity. Did something happen behind the sun? Did Atlas interact with something we were not meant to witness? Mirfin Jarfhedi? Think of the symbolism. A comet vanishes in light, then reappears wounded, changed. Ancient cultures would have read this as an omen. Death and rebirth, the sign of gods remaking the sky. Modern science, stripped of ritual, can only call it anomaly, but anomaly does not ease the mind. It sharpens it. By September 16th, debate raged. Some claimed the scar was an imaging artifact, a trick of stacking and filters. Others insisted the feature persisted across independent datasets. The dividing line was not just technical, it was psychological. Those who trusted the official narrative saw noise. Those who doubted saw intent. And once you begin to suspect intent, you cannot unsee it. Imagine looking at the moon and discovering a perfect square etched into its face. Would you call it geology, or would you wonder who carved it? That is the feeling Atlas gave in its return. More disturbing was the shift in brightness. Instead of a steady coma, Atlas now pulsed, fluctuating on cycles shorter than natural jets of gas should allow. Amateurs described it like a flicker, as though something mechanical was regulating output. Natural sublimation releases irregularly, but this had cadence. Cadence is design. Again, no certainty. Again, only anomaly. But anomalies, stacked atop anomalies, do not dissolve. They weigh down the silence until it cracks. Whereas in the official channels, words grew even softer. Press releases spoke of unexpected fragmentation, a term vague enough to mean anything from harmless outgassing to catastrophic breakup. Yet no fragments were tracked, no debris fields modeled. Instead, a single body reappeared, scarred but intact. So what fragmented, and why was the word chosen at all? One astronomer whispered off record, "It reemerged with scars. That is all I can say." The scars changed the narrative. Before, Atlas was an anomaly of orbit, chemistry, and signals. After, it became an object that bore marks of activity. It was no longer just what it was what had happened to it. The blackout had not erased the story. It had written the next chapter into Atlas's skin. And scars, unlike numbers, cannot be erased by silence. Shh. This was the moment suspicion deepened into dread, for if Atlas could vanish and return altered, then what else could vanish behind the sun? What else could come back carrying secrets written in scars? Perhaps it was still only ice and dust. Perhaps the marks were tricks of light, glitches in optics. Or perhaps, in the most unsettling possibility, Atlas was never meant to be observed continuously. Perhaps its journey included a stage we were never invited to see. We are left with the evidence that survives. Photos clearer from amateurs than from agencies. Logs edited after the fact. Whispers of docking scars. And a silence heavier than any admission. Atlas reemerged. It was scarred. And the scars spoke louder than any press release. On October 3rd, 2020, the orbit of Atlas aligned in such a way that its trajectory skimmed uncomfortably close to the corridor, long used for Mars transfer windows. This coincidence, if you call it that, resurrected every unease seeded by the anomalies we've already traced. The knife-like orbit, the chemical recipe, the patient signal, the blackout, and the scars. Now the question shifted from what is Atlas to what is Atlas for. Mars has always been the mirror in our sky, a world near enough to tempt us, yet harsh enough to humble us. Thin atmosphere, frozen deserts, silence broken only by dust storms. Every blueprint for colonization hinges on one principle: change the sky. In the recipe, repeated by Atlas, dominant carbon dioxide, the lever of greenhouse warming, is the first ingredient of that change. If you think this is speculation too far, pause. On October 6th, a briefing inside the European Space Agency discussed potential atmospheric implications of sustained CO2 plume delivery to Mars. The minutes are public, the graphs are not, but the wording is clinical. Sustained plume delivery. That phrase doesn't describe comets. It describes devices. At the same time, amateurs monitoring Atlas noted something more subtle. The flickering brightness that had begun after its reemergence now pulsed in a cadence that echoed telemetry intervals used in spacecraft communication. Not proof, but pattern. And pattern is the closest thing to voice when the cosmos refuses language. One amateur in Arizona wrote, "If this were just outgassing, it would be chaos. But this flicker, it feels like heartbeat, like the timing of a system waiting for acknowledgement." His observation gathered quiet support before his post disappeared, leaving behind only replies to nothing. Mars itself seemed to answer the suspicion. In the weeks following Atlas's closest corridor pass, orbiters above Mars detected a small but measurable spike in atmospheric density, concentrated in regions aligned with the projected path. The official explanation was dust storms, seasonal variability. Convenient, yes. But the data plots, when overlaid with Atlas's timing, felt like echoes responding to a call. A scientist from a North American lab, speaking under condition of anonymity, left a phrase that has since lived in the undercurrents of discussion. Atlas rode on Mars with gas. The verdict is written in the air. Let us step back. A verdict is not proof. It is the conclusion drawn when evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. The Martian atmosphere is still thin, still hostile. No one woke to green fields and oceans. But the numbers did change, and the change mirrored exactly what a CO2 injection would begin. And so suspicion hardened. Atlas was not simply passing by Mars. It was interacting with it, testing, seeding, writing in gases where the rest of us write in ink. There is a temptation to leap, to claim intent without hesitation. Resist it. The evidence is still anomaly, not confession. Yet anomaly after anomaly, silence after silence, the ledger is no longer neutral. When a jury sees patterns ignored by the judge, it begins to whisper among itself. That is where we stand. Humanity as a jury, watching a trial where the defendant never speaks. And the verdict many whispered in October 2020 was chillingly simple. Atlas was not a comet. Atlas was a message, and Mars was the first page. Consider the symbolism. Mars, the planet of war in ancient myth, becoming the recipient of the scarred traveler's breath. In the Sumerian cycle, the gods marked worlds with fire and air. In the modern cycle, we mark them with math and data. Both cycles echo with the same dread. What if we are not the authors? What if we are only the readers, given just enough fragments to know a larger story is unfolding? What does it mean for humanity if a body from the dark edges of space can alter a neighbor's atmosphere, even slightly? Do we call it chance? Do we call it warning? Or do we admit, with trembling honesty, that we might be witnessing someone else's experiment, an experiment we were never meant to grade? Atlas crossed near Mars. Mars changed, faintly but measurably. The verdict may not be conclusive, but it is recorded. And once a verdict is written, it cannot be unwritten. On October 21st, 2020, 3 weeks after Atlas brushed past the Martian corridor, a peculiar silence fell. Not in the skies this time, but in the archives. Observatories, research institutes, and space agencies that had, until then, updated their public databases daily suddenly froze. The logs that should have shown the tail end of Atlas's Martian proximity stopped refreshing. The last entries read like sentences cut in half. You may not follow data feeds every night, but those who do know their rhythm, timestamps, magnitudes, coordinate shifts, they flow like the ticking of a cosmic clock. Then abruptly that clock stopped. Pages that should have carried numbers carried error messages, and when they returned, the dates had skipped ahead, leaving a blank stretch where Atlas should have been inscribed in the sky forever. Why silence a record if the story is harmless? The amateurs noticed first. In forums dedicated to sharing calibration techniques, they began to complain. Where are the raw logs? Why are the archives rolling back? Within hours, screenshots circulated. Old data entries altered, some stripped of detail, others replaced with generic placeholder notes. One amateur, a retired engineer, compared cached copies on his hard drive to the updated files online. The differences were not trivial. Wavelengths missing, thermal profiles smoothed flat, values rounded where precision had once cut like a knife. It was not erasure, it was rewriting. On October 23rd, a small leak surfaced. An internal email from a European data server admin warned colleagues not to speak about the Atlas rollback. The message was careful. System harmonization requires removal of unverified entries, but the language betrayed itself. Removal, harmonization, unverified, all code words in bureaucratic dialect. In plain speech, certain details had to disappear because they did not fit the script. And what were those details? Amateur backups show that in the days following Atlas's Martian pass, several observatories recorded faint ultraviolet emissions, an unusual profile for a comet retreating from perihelion. Emissions that hinted at high-energy reactions, not just sublimating ice. They are gone now, scrubbed from the official record. Think of the implications. If ultraviolet anomalies had been left unaltered, they would have demanded an explanation. And explanations lead to questions, questions lead to doubt, and doubt erodes control. Silence is easier, but silence, repeated often enough, becomes louder than data. There's another layer to this blackout. The Vatican Observatory. Long a quiet participant in astronomical research, it maintains one of the most historic archives of sky records. In late October, researchers who had requested access to past cometary comparisons received polite rejections with a curious phrase, data embargoed for review of contextual accuracy. An embargo on ancient records? Centuries-old logs placed suddenly behind locked doors just when a modern object begins to challenge definition? Coincidence or choreography? Whispers began. The old texts, the Sumerian tablets, the medieval chronicles of guest stars and wandering torches. Were they too being reconsidered in the light of Atlas? Was the silence of the archives not just about present data, but about connecting past warnings with current events? On October 27th, NASA held a briefing. The press expected updates. Instead, the speaker said only this: Atlas remains under observation. Current data aligns with prior models. There's no cause for concern. The statement lasted less than 3 minutes. No questions permitted. No slides shown. The world's premier space agency, reduced to a monotone reassurance, while silence did the work words once did. That night, an amateur posted a single line beneath a blurry screenshot of Atlas re-emerging once more. The silence is the anomaly now. The post spread quietly, echoed in comments, reposted in whispers. For many, It became the defining phrase of the Atlas mystery. Silence of the archives does not erase Atlas. It engraves it deeper, because absence, once noticed, becomes its own form of evidence. And when those tasked with explaining the sky instead redact it, the rest of us are forced into the role of investigators. You may trust the silence, or you may see it for what it is, the loudest warning of all. On November 9th, 2020, the rebellion began, not with marches in the street, but with pixels on screens. A cluster of amateur astronomers from Spain, Chile, and Australia launched what they called a mirror watch, a coordinated campaign to capture Atlas every night, stack exposures, and upload the raw files to multiple independent servers. Their reason was simple. If the official archives fall silent, we will build our own. What started as a handful of enthusiasts grew into hundreds within days. Discord servers filled with chatter, Telegram groups pinged with links to fresh uploads. Amateurs who had once tinkered with backyard rigs now became the guardians of the sky's continuity. Their motto spread like wildfire: the sky belongs to no one. And then, the first true crack appeared. Chaskron. On November 13th, an Australian group released a stacked image that showed Atlas in higher resolution than any NASA release since September. The detail was undeniable. A rectangular void across the surface, the same scar noted weeks earlier, but now clearer, sharper, and more disturbing still. Along one edge of the scar, faint luminescence. Not reflective glare, not cosmic ray strike. A glow. Within 24 hours, the image was gone from the platform that hosted it, the group's account was suspended, and the link replaced by a generic 404 not found. But the internet does not forget. Copies survived. The glow became the new obsession. Was Atlas not just scarred, but alive with activity? That same week, an Italian amateur posted a video, a short time-lapse of Atlas pulsing faintly in brightness every 47 minutes. Not random, not chaotic, timed. And when viewers overlaid the pulse intervals with the 1-hour radio knock recorded months earlier, the numbers almost aligned. The thread's headline said it all. The signal is now visible. Of course, skeptics countered. Pulses could be artifacts, stacking errors, noise masquerading as order. But skeptics could not explain why independent groups across continents reported the same periodicity, nor why their uploads vanished so quickly from mainstream platforms. So that pattern of disappearance became fuel. The more images were pulled, the more the rebellion hardened. Amateurs began watermarking their captures with open slogans: "Do not erase, public sky." If NASA is silent, we are not. And with every upload, every pulsing pixel, the rebellion spread. Atlas was no longer just a comet, or even just an anomaly. It was a battlefield between silence and disclosure. On November 18th, a leak surfaced from within one of the groups. A PDF of email correspondence, allegedly from a university observatory, warning students not to participate in unsanctioned monitoring. The line that set fires across the community was blunt. Unauthorized imaging will only confuse the public, confuse, or reveal. The amateurs responded in the only way they could, by doubling down. They live-streamed their sessions. They archived their data across dozens of servers, some hosted anonymously. They posted to forums in different languages, ensuring no single authority could erase them all. And amid this chaos, a new revelation emerged. On November 22nd, a Chilean group posted a comparative dataset showing faint chemical emission lines that had never been acknowledged in official releases. Traces of methane and ammonia in proportions too neat to dismiss as noise. These gases are unstable in sunlight, fleeting signatures, yet here they were, embedded in Atlas's breath. Why hide them? Why not admit their presence? Unless their presence implied something more deliberate than ice sublimating under heat. But by now, the rebellion was no longer about astronomy. It was about trust, about whether the cosmos was being shared with us or edited for us. Amateurs, armed with consumer gear, had forced the world to see scars, pulses, glows, and gases that official channels avoided. They had turned their rebellion into testimony. One phrase, painted across the header of a forum that refused to vanish, captured the spirit. We are not stargazers anymore. We are witnesses. And being a witness changes everything. When the rebellion did not end the silence of the agencies, but it broke the monopoly. No one could now say with confidence that Atlas was ordinary. The public had seen too much, even if only in fragments, blurry frames, and hurried downloads. The amateurs had done more than record the sky. They had shifted the narrative from passive wonder to active resistance, from asking what is Atlas to demanding why are we not told. And in that shift, the story crossed a threshold from astronomy to accountability. On November 29th, 2020, the whispers began to move from observatories and forums to the shadowed corridors of Rome. Not from politicians, nor even astronomers, but from an institution that has stared at the heavens far longer than any telescope, the Vatican Observatory. It began with a rumor. A scholar had requested access to early modern star charts, documents kept in the Jesuit archives, only to be told they were temporarily restricted. The reason given? Contextual anomalies, under review. Anomalies. The same word used to describe Atlas. Suddenly, a centuries-old collection of parchment maps and journals was treated as if they contained classified blueprints. Why does Rome, guardian of the past, suddenly close its doors when the present sky begins to burn with questions? On December the 2nd, an Italian newspaper published a short article about unusual archival restrictions, noting that requests for cometary records from the 15th and 16th centuries had been placed under embargo. The article vanished within 24 hours, replaced by an error message. But screenshots survived, and in one paragraph, a single sentence lingered. References to the wandering torch and the silent messenger have been pulled for contextual review. The wandering torch, the silent messenger, names drawn from chronicles written long before modern science. Words that echo strangely against Atlas's story, a body wandering with intent, a messenger that speaks not with voice but with scars, signals, and silence. Once inside Italy, whispers spread further. Priests connected to the observatory mentioned, off record, that patterns had reappeared. The word patterns is vague in theology, but precise in science. What patterns? Alignments of past sightings with current anomalies? Recurrences in timing, chemistry, or orbit? We do not know, but the silence spoke. When the church, so eager to catalog, to preserve, to display, suddenly hides its oldest sky records, it is not because the pages are fragile. It is because the meaning is. Were you one of a strange leak then surfaced on December 5th? A scanned fragment of a Latin manuscript, barely legible, circulated on encrypted forums. It contained a passage translated loosely as a blade of light that carves the heavens, whose breath stirs the red world, whose return shall mark the silence of kings. The provenance is debated. Some say it was forged, others that it came from the Jesuit astronomers of the 1600s. Yet the phrasing is haunting, a blade of light. The red world. Silence. The echoes of Atlas whispered across centuries. Think about this. Ancient chroniclers wrote in metaphor, but metaphors often carry seeds of observation. A blade of light recalls the knife-like orbit. The breath that stirs the red world mirrors Atlas's chemical influence on Mars. The silence of kings might not mean monarchs at all. It might mean institutions, leaders, authorities, who fall mute when asked for truth, coincidence, or prophecy repeating in patterns of data and denial. Rome has always been a keeper of secrets, but secrets about the sky? That is different. For centuries, the heavens were not only a field of study, they were a theology, a script written by the divine. To find something in those heavens that resists both science and faith is to risk unseating the oldest order. So perhaps the archives did not close to protect fragile pages. Perhaps they closed to protect fragile belief. One Italian amateur astronomer put it best when he posted, before his account was suspended. When Rome silences the past, it is because the past speaks too loudly to the present. And here we stand, caught between what our instruments see and what our archives will not show, between anomalies written in pixels and warnings written in ink. The result is the same: silence, the heaviest evidence of all. Look, so what do the whispers from Rome tell us? That Atlas may not only be a story of now, but a story that is echoed before, hidden, renamed, sealed, until the pattern forced itself back into the light. The silence of archives we can explain as caution. The silence of institutions we can explain as politics, but the silence of centuries-old records, withdrawn at the exact moment the sky repeats their imagery, that silence we cannot explain away. On December 14th, 2020, while Atlas drifted further from the sun, another anomaly whispered through the void, not in light this time, but in radio silence that was not silent at all. At Azure 2.17 UTC, a faint signal emerged on amateur receivers in South America. A pulse, buried deep in static, so weak it seemed accidental. But when filtered and aligned, the pulse revealed something chilling. It mirrored the 1-hour rhythm first reported in June. Only now it carried modulation. Not noise, not chaos, a pattern. One amateur described it as a knock that had learned to speak. The signal was fractured, its intervals uneven, as if distorted by distance or intention. Yet embedded in the distortion was a recurrence. 3 short bursts, one long, then pause, then repeat. To Morse code enthusiasts, it resembled the simplest of signatures, a mark of presence, the cosmic equivalent of saying, "I am still here." Dauerdesruanmis official receivers said nothing. NASA's Deep Space Network logs for that day are publicly available, but oddly the window that covered O2 03 OJ0 UTC is missing from the published dataset. A gap, just as there was in April, a pattern of disappearance to match the pattern of the signal. Coincidence or choreography? The amateurs acted quickly. Within 12 hours, spectrograms of the shadow signal appeared across forums. Bright stripes against a black background, faint but unmistakable. The stripes curved with Doppler shifts consistent with Atlas's trajectory. It was as if the signal itself clung to the object, rising and falling with its movement. And then, predictably, the forums began to vanish. One by one, threads locked. One by one, accounts deleted. But the screenshots had already spread. The shadow signal could not be silenced once it had spoken. Biawega, why does a comet knock in radio bands? Why does it repeat intervals across months? Intervals that now evolve into rhythm. If this were interference, why would it align with orbital motion? If this were equipment error, why would amateurs across continents hear the same fractured cadence? The explanation offered by agencies was clinical, artifact of local interference. Yet no one explained why the artifact was global, why it carried structure, why it vanished from official logs even as backyard dishes captured it. Here's the deeper unease. Signals define relationships. In nature, randomness dominates. But signals, especially repeated ones, imply exchange. A call and a response. A code awaiting recognition. The shadow signal felt less like astronomy and more like communication. Some dared to ask, was this Atlas speaking or Atlas relaying? A transmitter of something larger, unseen, silent, except through its scarred messenger? Even in encrypted circles, a leak appeared, supposedly from a technician at a European ground station. It contained a single line. Shadow echo consistent. Internal note. Non-terrestrial modulation flagged. The authenticity cannot be proven, but the phrase non-terrestrial modulation spread like wildfire. And so suspicion deepened. Atlas was not just a body, it was a node. The implications are staggering. If the signal is real, then Atlas is no longer anomaly. It is participant. A participant in a conversation we cannot yet translate. And if it is participant, then who is the other voice? Perhaps silence itself is the answer. Silence from agencies, silence from archives, silence from Rome. Because admitting a signal would mean admitting a sender. And admitting a sender would unravel every comfort we have built about the sky being empty. But the shadow signal did not roar. It whispered, but whispers, when forbidden, cut deeper than shouts. For those who heard it, the cosmos was no longer a void. It was a forest. And in that forest, someone, or something, had knocked again. On December 28th, 2020, Atlas was tracked once more, this time by dual observatories working in tandem across hemispheres, one in Hawaii, the other in Chile. The goal was simple: capture simultaneous data and compare results, a basic safeguard against noise. But what emerged from that night was not clarity, it was fracture. At 04:15 UTC, the Hawaiian instruments reported Atlas's coma swelling, a brightening of nearly 20%. At the exact same moment, the Chilean telescope recorded the opposite, dimming, as if the light had been siphoned away. 2 instruments, 2 continents, 1 object, yet the data pointed in opposite directions. Which one was true? Or were both true, reflecting a deeper anomaly that Atlas presented different faces to different eyes? The findings were uploaded briefly to a shared academic server. For 47 minutes, the world could see 2 charts that should have overlapped, but instead diverged like broken glass. Then predictably, the mirror was swept clean. The upload vanished, the link dead. Later, a statement surfaced calling it calibration error. But the researchers who saw it in time used another phrase, fractured mirror. The fractured mirror became the symbol of Atlas's duplicity. It suggested an object capable not of reflecting the same truth, but of splitting it, presenting one reality here, another there. A comet that wore masks. Arctic amateurs, already emboldened by their rebellion, tried their own double observations. Pairs of hobbyists across continents coordinated exposures within the same hour. What they found deepened the fracture. In one case, a German team recorded Atlas with a faint greenish glow, while a Canadian group, nearly simultaneous, logged it as stark white. Different colors, same moment. Could atmospheric conditions explain it? Perhaps. But the timing, the precision, the repetition of the divide, it felt engineered, as though Atlas itself resisted singular description. Think of the implications. If an object can appear differently depending on who looks, then truth itself becomes relative. Science, built on replication, shatters. The fractured mirror is not just a problem for astronomy. It is a problem for trust, and trust was already thin. No whispers soon followed. A leak from a Scandinavian institute claimed their internal report used a forbidden word, phase masking, a technique in optics to control how light is seen, one pattern here, another there. If natural, it was unprecedented. If deliberate, it was terrifying. Because phase masking is not the behavior of a rock. It is the behavior of a device designed to conceal. By January 2nd, 2021, the fractured mirror had become legend in the forums. Users created collages of conflicting images, overlaying them to show the impossibility. Some saw structure in the overlap, the scars aligning into sharper geometry, the flicker resolving into almost rectangular outlines. Others warned against pareidolia, seeing shapes where there are none, yet even they could not dismiss the raw fact. Atlas refused consistency. And inconsistency is the bedrock of science. An object that defies it is either mismeasured or misdescribed. So what does Atlas mirror back to us? That the universe may not obey the simplicity we crave. That the thing we call a comet may not want to be known. Or worse, that it wants to be known differently depending on who is watching. The fractured mirror does not show us Atlas. It shows us ourselves, our desperation for one story, confronted with the possibility of many. And in that confrontation, another silence grew. On January 11th, 2021, Atlas reached a stretch of sky where everything should have been predictable. Its orbit, already plotted months in advance, was supposed to follow the knife-edge path carved by celestial mechanics. Astronomers marked their calendars. The object would cross a specific frame at 0241 UTC. Cameras were ready, antennas were tuned, but when the moment came, the frame was empty. The coordinates returned nothing but silence. But for 3 hours, observatories searched the expected corridor. Some logged faint streaks that dissolved into noise, others captured stars, but no moving target. The great traveler that had dominated whispers for almost a year had slipped into nothingness. By dawn, the word spread across private channels. Atlas did not appear where it should have been. The official response was cautious. NASA's Minor Planet Center issued a brief note. Object brightness below detection threshold. Continued monitoring advised. A safe statement, but one that avoided the truth. Amateurs were already screaming. A body that bright cannot vanish without leaving trace. The amateurs called it what it was, the vanishing point. In forums, screenshots poured in. Empty star fields where Atlas should have been. Frames compared side by side with earlier nights. On the 10th, there was a scarred, flickering traveler. On the 11th, The sky was blank. One image, taken in Spain, showed a strange artifact at the edge of the field, an arc of light bending as though something massive had just slipped out of visibility. The poster titled it, "Exit Wound of the Sky." Theories multiplied. Some said Atlas had fragmented completely, disintegrating like comets do when their structures fail. But fragmentation leaves debris, a cloud brighter than the nucleus itself. No such cloud was seen. Others speculated that the scarred object had simply altered reflectivity, turning its dark side to Earth. But that excuse felt too neat, too convenient. The most unsettling speculation came from those who remembered the blackout behind the sun. They argued that what disappeared then had not been Atlas. It had been its mask. And now, at the vanishing point, the mask had fallen again, this time not to re-emerge. A leak soon circulated from an observatory in South America. A single line, copied from an internal log. Object absence inconsistent with orbital mechanics. That phrase is damning. Orbital mechanics is the one law that does not lie. Objects follow gravity. They cannot choose. Unless Atlas was never simply an object. The Suishio On January 12th, a different kind of silence followed. The amateur forums that had carried the rebellion for months fell quiet. Without frames, without streaks, without anomalies to point to, what could they post? The absence itself was too fragile to prove. The rebellion had lived on pixels. Without them, all that remained was faith and doubt. Yet some clung to the anomaly. In Lisbon, one team reported faint radio noise at the old knock frequency, as though the shadow signal pulsed on without a body to host it. A signal without a source, an echo without a voice. If true, it suggested that Atlas had not vanished. It had only shed visibility, leaving its whisper intact. What is the vanishing point, really? It is the most terrifying of anomalies. Not what appears, but what fails to appear. We can explain a scar, a flicker, a glow. We cannot explain a disappearance. The cosmos is relentless in its bookkeeping. When a body vanishes from its ledger, the error is not in the sky. It is in what we believe we know. The vanishing point was not merely the loss of Atlas. It was the loss of certainty. For a year, we had tracked something that defied labels but obeyed visibility. Now even visibility was gone. What remained was silence, and silence is heavier than data. If a comet can disappear in plain sight, what else can vanish when no one is looking? On January 27th, 2021, 2 weeks after Atlas slipped into nothingness, the night sky betrayed a secret. It began with a single amateur in Finland who captured a faint glimmer while testing his equipment against the aurora. A dot where no cataloged star should be, pulsing faintly in the region Atlas once occupied. At first he dismissed it as a sensor glitch, but then the dot pulsed again, and it pulsed in rhythm. Not the erratic flicker of cosmic rays, not the chaos of noise, but the same fractured cadence that had haunted radio receivers weeks before. 3 short, 1 long, a whisper of persistence, as if the vanished traveler had left behind not a body, but a light, a forgotten light. By January 29th, confirmations arrived from across latitudes. Observers in Canada, Brazil, and South Africa independently reported the same anomaly, a faint source emerging intermittently, always at the edge of visibility, always in the place where Atlas's orbital path would predict a ghost to appear. The official channels were silent. The Minor Planet Center issued no update. NASA's trackers showed no new detections. Yet the amateurs compared their timestamps and discovered a chilling alignment. Every pulse of light coincided with the shadow signal still echoing faintly on shortwave radio. The vanished body, it seemed, had not left us entirely. It had changed medium, from matter to message, from orbiting object to flickering beacon. Theories exploded. Some argued Atlas had fragmented into a debris cloud whose reflective geometry produced the pulses. Others claimed the light was a projection, an emission of energy not natural to comets. A few dared to whisper the most unsettling possibility, that Atlas had always been more transmitter than traveler, and that its vanishing point was not an end, but a transition into something that no longer needed to be seen, only to be felt. One forum thread captured the mood. It's like watching a lighthouse after the ship has sunk. The light is still calling, but the vessel is gone. The phrase spread, haunting in its simplicity. A lighthouse with no keeper, a signal with no sender. Yet the cadence of the light refused to fade. Observers tracked it over nights, noting its endurance. Where a comet's brightness should fade with distance from the sun, the forgotten light did not. It held, it pulsed, it remembered. A small leak then surfaced, allegedly from within a European observatory. The note contained only one line: object no longer extant. Residual luminosity classified as anomalous beacon. Anomalous beacon, two words that carry the weight of both science and myth. Beacon implies intent. Anomalous admits fear. Together they rewrite the story from comet to message. The forgotten light is not bright enough for the casual skywatcher. You cannot step outside and see it with naked eyes. But that is what makes it more unsettling. It hides in thresholds, between certainty and imagination, between data and faith, too faint to dominate the sky, too consistent to be dismissed. It is the ghost of Atlas, etched not in rock or ice, but in intervals of light and silence. But if Atlas was a blade that cut across the heavens, then the forgotten light is the scar left behind, a scar not on the object, but on our perception. It tells us that disappearance is not erasure, that silence is not absence, that what we thought we lost may have only changed form. And if a comet can vanish yet leave behind a message, then we must ask, what is the message meant to say? Is it warning? Is it invitation? Or is it something more chilling, a test to see if we are capable of noticing at all? The forgotten light flickers the Hekophaya, and each flicker asks us the same question. Do you believe the story ended when Atlas vanished? Or do you believe that endings are only beginnings disguised as silence? By February 10th, 2021, the story of Atlas had split the world in two. On one side stood the skeptics, armed with the cold language of science, insisting that every anomaly, every scar, every blackout, every flicker of light could be explained by mundane physics if only we were patient enough to refine the models. On the other side were the witnesses, amateurs, whistleblowers, and restless observers who had seen too much to accept silence. Between them stretched a widening gulf, a divide not only of evidence, but of belief. This divide was not just intellectual, it was emotional. For the skeptics, doubt was safety. If Atlas was just ice and dust, then the world remained intact, the cosmos indifferent but predictable. For the believers, doubt was impossible. They had seen the glow in the scar, the fractured mirror of dual images, the forgotten light pulsing in rhythm. They had listened to silence too heavy to ignore. For them, the story had already leapt beyond explanation. The tension spilled into public discourse. Forums once dedicated to telescope calibration now split into factions. Threads devolved into accusations. You want this to be extraordinary, said one side. You refuse to see what's in front of you, said the other. Some scientists tried to mediate, but their words rang hollow when they avoided the raw anomalies. Trust eroded further each day. Even institutions felt the pressure. In mid-February, a European academic society released a carefully worded statement acknowledging discrepancies in observational datasets. For a moment, the believers felt vindicated, but the statement ended with a familiar refrain. At this time, no extraordinary conclusions are warranted, a verdict that satisfied no one. Meanwhile, the forgotten light continued to pulse. It was not bright enough for newspapers, not dramatic enough for headlines, but those who tracked it documented its rhythm with almost religious devotion. Some began calling it the silent beacon. Others gave it names drawn from myth, the torch without flame, the messenger's ghost, and here the divide deepened. For the skeptics, this naming was fantasy, the language of myth imposed on noise. For the believers, it was reverence, an attempt to describe what science refused to. In one haunting case, a group of schoolchildren in Argentina, guided by an amateur astronomer, watched the faint flicker through a projection on a classroom wall. One of them, no older than 10, whispered, "It's blinking like it wants us to answer." That moment spread across forums like wildfire, quoted as proof that the human instinct recognized intent where official silence denied it. The divide of belief was no longer about Atlas itself. It was about us, about how humans confront the unknown, with denial or with surrender, with equations or with awe. And perhaps that is the truest anomaly of all. Not the orbit, not the scars, not the blackout, but the way one body in the sky fractured humanity into two tribes, those who demanded silence and those who demanded truth. So, which tribe are you in? Do you cling to the comfort of skepticism, where anomalies are only errors waiting to be corrected? Or do you join the witnesses, staring at the scarred messenger, whispering that the silence itself is a message? That is the divide Atlas has carved, not in the heavens, but in us. On March 3rd, 2021, the silence broke. For nearly 6 weeks, Atlas had been little more than a ghost in the sky, its forgotten light pulsing faintly, its shadow signal barely detectable on shortwave bands. But on that night, for precisely 11 minutes and 14 seconds, receivers across the globe caught something no one expected, a transmission. Not a flicker, not a cadence, not a knock. A full structured emission that carried the weight of intention. It began at 01:06 UTC, recorded almost simultaneously in Finland, Chile, and Japan. Amateur radio dishes, built from scavenged parts and garage ingenuity, lit up with a sound unlike static. The pattern was sharp, layered, and recursive, repeating in intervals too precise for random noise. At its core was a rising and falling hum, like a breath, stretched into mathematics. Overlaid were bursts that mapped into binary sequences, ones and zeros, perfectly spaced. And within those sequences, a haunting symmetry emerged. Triplets, mirrored, inverted, then repeated. Then, the last transmission. Those who first heard it described it as unsettling, even beautiful. One listener in Tokyo wrote, "It felt like listening to a heartbeat that wasn't ours." Another in Argentina, his voice shaking on a live stream, whispered, "This isn't noise. This is someone knocking louder." The data spread fast. Within hours, files were uploaded to open servers, dissected by codebreakers, linguists, even musicians. Some claimed it resembled prime numbers. Others swore it echoed the Fibonacci sequence. A few heard something deeper, almost organic, like whale song stretched across cosmic static. What everyone agreed upon was this: it was not random. Its official reaction was immediate, and predictably cautious. NASA and ESA both issued identical statements. Reports of unusual radio interference are under review. Current evidence does not indicate extraterrestrial origin. But the amateur logs spoke louder. Hundreds of receivers across multiple continents had captured the same sequence at the same time, all aligned with Atlas's projected position. This was not interference. This was source. And then came the silence. By 01:18 UTC, the signal ceased. Atlas did not speak again. Theories bloomed like wildfire. Some said it was a farewell, a final burst before the messenger dissolved. Others insisted it was a test, a probe to measure whether we would notice. A few whispered the most terrifying thought, that it was not a message at all, but a key, broadcast once, waiting for someone, somewhere, to turn the lock. A mathematician in Germany, analyzing the structure, noted that the binary bursts, when graphed, formed a shape, a rising arc that ended in a sharp descent. To him, it looked like an orbit cut short, a trajectory interrupted. Was the transmission a map of Atlas's own fate, or a warning of ours? The divide of belief, already deep, became a canyon. Skeptics argued the data was misinterpreted interference, amplified by collective hysteria. Believers countered with charts, overlays, and recordings that aligned too perfectly to dismiss. One phrase echoed in forums: "If this is noise, why does it repeat across oceans?" Even those who clung to skepticism could not explain the synchronization. Interference does not align in Finland and Chile at the same second, carrying the same structure. Interference does not draw graphs in binary. To Sumaya Sebrek, perhaps the most haunting element of the last transmission was not its structure, but its timing. It came after Atlas's vanishing point, after its transformation into forgotten light, as though the body had died, but the voice remained. A message from absence, a signal from silence. Think of the metaphors. Ancient prophets wrote of voices from burning bushes, angels speaking from the void. Now, in our age of satellites and spectrograms, we hear a voice from the scar of a comet. The medium changes. The unease remains. We found the Vatican archives stirred again. On March 8th, a researcher leaked a translated fragment from a 14th century chronicle, once dismissed as allegory. The wandering torch fell silent, but on the third season, it spoke with numbers, and the rulers turned their faces away. Coincidence or prophecy repeating in the cadence of Atlas? The whisper spread. Had we heard this story before, centuries ago, in metaphors we failed to translate? And here's the riddle that lingers. If the last transmission was meant for us, why only once? Why so brief? Why in a form that flirts with comprehension but denies certainty? Unless certainty was never the point. Unless the point was simply to remind us, you are not alone, and you are not in control. The silence after the signal was heavier than before. Once you hear a voice, silence is no longer absence. It is withholding. Every night after March 3rd, receivers waited, dishes tilted, hoping for another whisper. But the sky returned only emptiness. The forgotten light dimmed. The radio bands carried only noise. And so the last transmission became a ghost within a ghost, a story that cannot be proven yet cannot be erased. For those who heard it, the cosmos will never be silent again. For those who did not, the doubt remains. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. So, I ask you, if a scarred traveler in the sky spoke once, and only once, what would you do with that voice? Would you dismiss it as static, or carry it like scripture? Would you call it an anomaly, or admit it as a message? Atlas is gone, its body lost, its scars dissolved into memory. But the last transmission lingers, in files, in whispers, in the haunting rhythm of 3 short and 1 long. A rhythm that asks, with every repetition, are you listening? By March 20th, 2021, the focus had shifted from the sky to the numbers. The last transmission had ended, but its echoes lingered in terabytes of recordings, endlessly analyzed by coders, linguists, physicists, and dreamers who refused to let the mystery go. Among them was a mathematician in Prague, who first noticed the pattern hidden within the binary pulses, a sequence of ratios, elegant and recursive, mapping not just primes or Fibonacci numbers, but something deeper, an equation that did not belong to chance. It began with a triplet of numbers embedded in the bursts, 3.141. At first glance, it looked like coincidence. Pi, a universal constant, but then came 2.718, Euler's number, then 1.618, the golden ratio. The sequence repeated, not randomly, but with eerie precision. To those decoding, it felt as though Atlas, or whatever Atlas carried, was pointing not to one number, but to the pillars of mathematics itself. And then came the anomaly, a 4th constant, unknown, irrational, yet consistent. When graphed, it mapped onto a curve resembling an orbital path bent unnaturally, as though gravity itself had been rewritten. This became known as the forbidden equation. The revelation spread in whispers. Codebreakers shared graphs in hidden forums, overlaying the ratios onto Atlas's trajectory. The curve fit too neatly. It was as if the transmission was saying, "This is how we bend the sky." The skeptics, of course, resisted. They argued pattern-seeking, coincidence, human bias. But even skeptics faltered when the unknown constant repeated across datasets, independent of country or receiver. If it were noise, why would the noise recite pi, Euler, and phi before introducing a stranger to the pantheon of numbers? On March 22nd, a leak appeared from within a European research institute, a PDF marked internal only. Inside was a simulation of orbital mechanics, modified by the unknown constant. The simulation showed an object approaching Mars, altering its atmospheric density, then vanishing without debris, exactly as Atlas had done. The document's last line chilled readers. This equation, if correct, implies manipulation of gravitational vectors at non-terrestrial scale. Manipulation of gravity, a phrase that belongs not in astronomy, but in mythology. Gods moving planets, titans shaping orbits. Now whispered in the sterile halls of science, hidden behind the word anomaly. Durishish no suristo aftamu, the Vatican whisper stirred again. A fragment of Latin text surfaced, translated as, "The sky bends to the number unspoken, the ratio forbidden, the key of those who walk unseen." Scholars argued forgery, believers argued prophecy, but the phrase, the number unspoken, fit too perfectly with the constant Atlas had delivered, and so the myth and the math merged. The divide of belief deepened further. Skeptics clung to probability, accusing the community of pareidolia in numbers. Believers countered with spreadsheets of repeating ratios. The argument was no longer about Atlas itself. It was about whether numbers can lie, and if they cannot, then the forbidden constant was not invention. It was revelation. For some, the revelation carried hope. If Atlas had delivered an equation, perhaps it was a gift, a key to mastering the very forces that bind us to Earth. Colonization, propulsion, energy, rewritten by a constant whispered across light years. For others, it carried dread. What if the equation was not for us at all? What if it was only left behind, like a code scrawled on a wall, meant for someone else to read? And what if by deciphering it, we are trespassing into knowledge not meant for our species? A haunting post from an anonymous account captured this fear. If Atlas gave us an equation, then we are already participants. We cannot choose ignorance anymore. Participation without consent. Knowledge as entanglement. That is the true terror of the forbidden equation. The constant itself remains unsolved. Some call it X37, others the Atlas ratio. Attempts to model it yield results that bend physics into impossible shapes. Gravitational wells without masses, trajectories without propulsion, lights that vanish but still whisper. Like Atlas itself, the constant refuses singular description, yet its presence is undeniable. Every dataset sings the same number, a refrain no one invited, yet no one can mute. The forbidden equation may be the scar Atlas left behind, etched not into its body, but into our mathematics. A scar we cannot erase, a whisper we cannot silence. For if the cosmos has chosen numbers as its language, then what we received was not noise. It was scripture. And scripture demands interpretation, even when interpretation divides us. So here we are. The comet is gone. The forgotten light flickers faintly. The last transmission has ceased. And yet the forbidden equation lingers, carved into the archives of amateurs and hidden files of institutions. An equation that might be weapon or salvation or warning. And the question remains, why give it to us? Why now? Perhaps the answer is simple and chilling. Not because we are ready, but because we were watching. By April 5th, 2021, whispers shifted from mourning Atlas's disappearance to something stranger. Prediction. Orbital calculations, rerun by both official astronomers and amateurs, suggested that if Atlas, or whatever Atlas had become, retained even fragments of its trajectory, it would return to observational range by late spring. The phrase return window began circulating in forums, not as certainty, but as anticipation. A date circled on calendars, not because the sky promised clarity, but because the void itself had demanded attention. At first, this seemed impossible. A comet that had fragmented, vanished, or transformed should have left nothing to track. And yet, in the days leading to April, faint anomalies teased at the edges of sky surveys. Irregular spikes in infrared sensors, ghost signatures appearing in sectors where nothing cataloged should exist. Always fleeting, always unexplained, but always just close enough to Atlas's projected corridor to ignite belief. One amateur in New Mexico noted a curious alignment. On April the 2nd, his stacked exposures caught a faint streak near the horizon. Not bright, but moving with the velocity expected of Atlas. When compared to the last known orbital solutions, the alignment was within 1 degree, too close to dismiss. He titled his upload simply, "The Door's Opening." Others followed. In South Africa, a radio telescope registered a narrowband anomaly at 02.07 UTC on April 4th, eerily close to the shadow signal frequency. In Norway, a faint pulsing light reappeared, almost identical to the forgotten beacon first seen in January. 3 sightings, 3 continents, within days of each other. Coincidence or return? For min caricature, institutions responded with silence. No press releases, no updates. But behind closed doors, leaks trickled out. A short note, allegedly from an internal NASA memo, circulated in encrypted channels. Return corridor under restricted observation. Unverified reemergence possible. Another from an observatory in Spain carried a phrase even more haunting. If confirmed, event recurs every 540 days. A cycle, a rhythm, a heartbeat of absence and return. The believers seized on this. If Atlas was tied to a cycle, then the vanishing point was not an end, but a phase, an eclipse of identity, an object or device that withdrew from visibility, only to reemerge in its own cadence. The return window was no longer speculation, it was expectation. The myths resurfaced, too. Ancient chronicles once dismissed as allegory began to echo with uncomfortable precision. A Babylonian tablet spoke of the torch that departs, yet returns to judge the skies. A medieval manuscript referenced a star of knives that hides and returns with new scars. For centuries, scholars treated these as metaphor. Now, aligned against Atlas's behavior, they felt more like forgotten data points. Was Atlas the same traveler, returning across epochs, each time renamed, each time half believed? Did the divide of belief widened again? Skeptics argued that the return window was nothing more than wishful thinking, an attempt to prolong a fading mystery. But even skeptics could not ignore the mounting anomalies. Noise does not align across hemispheres. Random error does not repeat in cycles. And silence, stretched across months, rarely cracks so suddenly with whispers from 3 continents at once. By mid-April, the atmosphere had shifted. The public was no longer waiting for authorities, they were waiting for the sky. The rebellion of amateurs had matured into a global network, ready to record, share, archive. No one trusted single sources anymore. No one trusted silence. And then, on April 18th, the return window opened. A faint streak appeared in multiple telescopes, moving too fast for an asteroid, too straight for debris. It was dimmer than Atlas once was, scar faint, glow subdued, but it was there. The messenger had returned. The forums erupted, posts filled with awe, fear, and anger. It's back. They can't hide it this time. We were right to wait. It's nos. Es ranks of did. But here was the unsettling truth. The Atlas that returned was not the same Atlas that vanished. Its orbit was altered by fractions of a degree, subtle but undeniable. Its light curve was uneven, pulsing with the cadence of the shadow signal, and its scar, once sharp, now looked like a closed wound, as if the object itself had healed. How does ice heal? How does a comet rewrite its orbit? How does silence become rhythm? The return window was not proof. Proof remains elusive, but it was enough to fracture doubt. Enough to whisper that the story of Atlas had not ended at the vanishing point. It had only paused, waiting for its cycle to turn. And so the watchers began again. Dishes tuned, lenses aligned, forums braced for the next anomaly. Because once an object disappears and reemerges, the sky itself is no longer a ledger of certainty. It is a script written in cycles of silence and return. Spying, the last line from the leaked Spanish memo, now reads like prophecy. If confirmed, event recurs every 540 days. So count with me. From the vanishing point in January, the next cycle points forward. A future date, marked not by calendars, but by unease. Will Atlas return again? Will it speak again? Or will its silence grow heavier until the cycle repeats once more? The return window has opened, and in its flickering light, one question remains. Did Atlas come back to remind us, or to prepare us? By May 2021, the return of Atlas had reignited an older, darker theory. A hypothesis first whispered by physicists, then amplified by novelists, and now resurrected by a comet that refused to stay gone, the dark forest. The premise is simple and chilling. The universe is not silent because it is empty. It is silent because it is full. Every civilization, aware of the others, hides. Every light, every signal risks exposure. And in a forest where every tree hides a hunter, silence is survival. For months, skeptics had dismissed Atlas's anomalies as coincidence, noise, or misinterpretation. But when the forgotten light pulsed, when the shadow signal whispered, when the last transmission carried ratios no comet should know, a new thought emerged. What if Atlas itself was not a message for us, but a test of us? A way to measure whether we, the noisy species, were willing to keep quiet in the forest. Consider this. If a civilization wanted to probe the galaxy without exposing itself, would it send emissaries? Would it broadcast? No. It would send silent scouts disguised as natural bodies, scarred messengers wrapped in ice and dust. They would vanish when observed, re-emerge when forgotten. They would whisper equations not as invitations, but as bait, to see who listens, who decodes, who responds. That is the terror of the dark forest. If Atlas is such a messenger, then by listening, by decoding, by broadcasting, by whispering in forums, we may have already given ourselves away. The whispers of Rome seem to hint at this centuries earlier. The wandering torch, the manuscript called it, the silent messenger. A torch that lights only when it wants to be seen. A messenger that delivers not comfort, but judgment. The dark forest hypothesis does not contradict this. It fulfills it. Amateurs across the globe wrestled with the possibility. In one forum, a user wrote, "If Atlas is a scout, then every telescope pointed at it was like shouting our coordinates into the dark." Another replied, "It's too late. We already answered the knock." For those who believed, the return window was no gift. It was a warning. Because in the dark forest, when something knocks, the only safe response is silence. And yet, silence was impossible. The human heart does not ignore mystery. We pointed, we measured, we shared. We could not look away. A disturbing leak emerged from within ESA in mid-May. A redacted briefing note, allegedly circulated among high-level staff, contained one line that spread like wildfire. "Do not engage further. Observation acceptable. Transmission forbidden." It read like policy, not science. As if institutions understood that listening was inevitable, but speaking back was fatal. Transmission forbidden. The phrase became a mantra in forums, repeated with equal parts irony and dread. Because humans always transmit. Curiosity is our nature, and in the dark forest, curiosity is exposure. Meet as the theory found further fuel in Atlas's anomalies. The fractured mirror, where the comet appeared differently from different angles, now seemed deliberate. A camouflage system. The forbidden equation, whispered in ratios of pi, Euler, and phi, looked less like a gift and more like a lure. The vanishing point, when Atlas disappeared entirely, resembled not destruction, but stealth. Every anomaly, reframed under the dark forest lens, looked less like accident and more like strategy. And if Atlas is strategy, then we are prey. The emotional divide widened once again. For believers, Atlas was proof that the dark forest is real. That we live in a galaxy where silence is survival and noise is death. For skeptics, the hypothesis was philosophy, not evidence. But even skeptics felt the weight of the unanswered question. If the universe is truly empty, why does every anomaly align into a pattern of silence, reemergence, and coded whisper? A chilling post appeared on a dark forum. An anonymous user uploaded a single image, a graph of the last transmission's ratios, overlaid with a forest silhouette. The caption read, "The forest is not empty. Atlas is the hunter's breath." The post vanished within hours, but screenshots remained, passed around like forbidden scripture. But the dark forest hypothesis is not proof. It is a lens, a way of seeing. But lenses matter. They shape fear. And once the lens of the dark forest was applied to Atlas, every silence, every flicker, every missing archive no longer looked like error. It looked like design, and design terrifies more than chance. By the end of May, discussions shifted from what Atlas was to what we should do. Some argued for silence, shut down transmissions, bury the data, pretend we never heard the knock. Others argued for defiance. If the forest is dark, then light a fire. Show them we are here, show them we are not afraid. Between the two, a chasm yawned wider than science, wider than belief. It was existential, because the real question was no longer about Atlas. It was about us, about how humanity chooses to live in the forest, as hunters, as prey, or as fools who mistake silence for safety. The dark forest hypothesis lingers like smoke after fire. We cannot prove it. We cannot disprove it. but once whispered, it cannot be unheard. An atlas, scarred, vanished, returned, whispering in numbers, may be its most chilling manifestation yet. So ask yourself, when the forest is silent, do you dare make a sound? By June 2021, the narrative had grown too large for skywatchers alone. The mystery of Atlas, the scars, the vanishing, the whispering signal, was no longer confined to telescopes and spectrograms. It had crept into libraries, archives, and records centuries old. Whispers spread of locked vaults, restricted documents, and files stamped with seals that no ordinary researcher could pierce. The institutions of memory, the keepers of our past, had suddenly become keepers of silence. One particular story began to circulate from within Italy. A researcher at the Vatican Observatory, speaking through encrypted channels, hinted that certain manuscripts had been abruptly withdrawn from public access, not because of their fragility, but because of their relevance. The codices, written in the late 1400s, described a torch with a scar that vanishes into the sun, but returns with numbers etched in its flame. The phrasing was uncanny, almost identical to the reports of Atlas in 2020. Yet when scholars requested access to these texts, they were told the documents were under review. Review in this context meant hidden. Elsewhere, the whispers thickened. In Germany, archivists claimed that star maps from the 17th century had been quietly reclassified, moved from open shelves into restricted holdings. In Britain, colonial-era records referencing wandering torches in the skies of India and South America were flagged for reassessment. And in France, a single journal entry from a Jesuit astronomer mentioning a comet that healed its wound after it returned from behind the sun was suddenly missing from the digitized database. The gap was obvious. Entries for January 1623 jumped directly to April, as if winter had been erased. Why erase unless the past speaks too clearly to the present? Leaks began surfacing in the strangest places, not in journals or scientific bulletins, but in forums frequented by archivists, genealogists, and historians. One user, claiming to be a staff member at a national archive, described being told to box and remove a set of 19th century observations of a scarred comet visible in multiple hemispheres. Another hinted that photographs from the early 20th century, glass plates showing faint objects near Mars, had been sealed under military interest. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Chernum termerkofrenin. For amateurs who had already waged a rebellion against silence in astronomy, this was salt in the wound. They asked, why should the sky belong to the archives? Why should our history of observation be hidden from us? Their rebellion expanded. No longer satisfied with capturing pixels through backyard telescopes, they began scouring online databases, trading restricted scans, piecing together fragments of text like archaeologists of forbidden knowledge. And the fragments painted a disturbing picture. A manuscript in Latin, translated clumsily but shared widely, described a messenger of knives that returns in cycles, speaking first in light, then in silence, then in numbers. A ship's log from 1714 spoke of sailors who saw a glowing scar on a comet, a scar that pulsed like breath. A monk's diary from 1589 told of priests in Rome debating whether a wandering torch was a divine sign or a test of faith. In each fragment, the motifs were the same: scar, silence, return, message. Coincidence? Or memory of the same traveler we call Atlas, resurfacing across centuries? Institutions, for their part, remained resolutely silent. NASA and ESA issued no statements about archives. The Vatican declined all comment, yet silence, as always, only amplified suspicion. If the past held no connection to Atlas, why hide it? Why erase? Some began to argue that archives are not neutral. They are curated forests, where documents are trees cut or spared according to need. And in this forest, the keeper of archives plays the role of hunter, not protecting truth, but guarding it, silencing it when it aligns too closely with the present. One chilling rumor emerged in July that a coalition of archivists across Europe had agreed on a quiet freeze of comet-related documents until the Atlas controversy cooled. A freeze not of preservation, but of suppression. If true, it would mean that silence was no longer an accident. It was policy. Amateurs coined a phrase for this: The keeper of archives. Not one person, but an idea. The unseen hand that ensures the past never speaks too loudly to the present. For some, the keeper was the Vatican. For others, it was NASA. For many, it was simply the machinery of power that has always decided which truths are remembered and which are buried. And here lies the true terror. In the age of data, hiding the past may be more dangerous than hiding the present. Because anomalies without context are strange, but anomalies with history are undeniable. If Atlas has appeared before, if the scarred messenger has cycled through centuries, then denial collapses. The story becomes not anomaly but pattern, and patterns are impossible to silence. Think of the implications. If records from 1623, 1714, 1857, and 1921 all point to the same scarred traveler, then Atlas is not comet, not coincidence. It is recurrence. It is design. It is the whisper of a truth older than our institutions, older than our skepticism. And the keeper of archives knows this. That is why the shelves are emptied, why manuscripts vanish, why digitized databases skip seasons. Silence is not absence, it is strategy. One anonymous archivist left a final message before their account was deleted. The documents are not destroyed, they are waiting. But when the sky speaks again, they will not be yours to see. So ask yourself, who decides what you are allowed to remember? Who guards the line between history and present, between anomaly and pattern? Is it science? Is it faith? Or is it the keeper of archives, silent, unseen, withholding not to protect the fragile pages, but to protect the fragile illusion that the sky has no memory? Because if the sky remembers, and the archives remember, then humanity must face a truth far heavier than a comet's scar. We are not witnessing a one-time anomaly. We are living in a story centuries old, a story someone desperately does not want you to read. By July 2021, suspicion turned toward one location whispered about for years, a high-altitude facility in the Andes, sometimes cited in leaks, sometimes denied in official maps. Among astronomers, it was known simply as the Silent Observatory, a place where cutting-edge instruments pointed at the heavens, yet little to nothing ever reached the public. The silence became impossible to ignore when Atlas's return window opened in April, while amateurs across continents scrambled to capture faint streaks and pulses of light. The Silent Observatory released no data, not a frame, not a spectrogram, not even a dismissal. For months, the facility maintained its muteness, like a fortress staring into the cosmos and refusing to speak. But leaks, as always, slipped through cracks. The first came from a technician who claimed to have once worked on its instruments. His anonymous post described a night in April when the observatory's primary mirror caught a non-luminous form crossing its field, a body darker than space itself, silhouetted only by the faint distortion it cast on surrounding stars. According to his account, the image was logged, flagged, then buried. I was told to scrub the logs, he wrote. The official record would show empty frames. But I saw it. It was there. Empty frames. The same motif that had haunted amateurs when Atlas vanished in January. Only now, the emptiness was deliberate, a curated silence. Now, a second leak emerged weeks later. A single still image, grainy and blurred, supposedly taken from a test feed at the observatory. The frame showed stars warped into arcs around an absence, a central void, perfectly black, as though light itself bent around something unseen. The image spread like wildfire, quickly denounced as a fake, yet it matched descriptions from the technician's post, too consistent to dismiss. And so, the legend of the Silent Observatory deepened. Why silence? Why hoard images when the world was begging for clarity? Some argued it was caution, that releasing raw data would only fuel hysteria. Others suspected collusion, that the observatory was part of a larger pattern of withheld truth, aligning with the keeper of archives, aligning with the missing logs, aligning with every institutional silence that trailed Atlas like a shadow. But for many, the silence itself was evidence. If nothing unusual had been seen, why scrub logs? Why erase images? Why issue no denial? The absence of denial is often more telling than denial itself. Amateurs, emboldened by defiance, began calling the facility the Black Mouth of the Andes. They claimed it swallowed data the way a black hole swallows light. Memes circulated, telescopes with mouths sewn shut, domes with padlocks instead of lenses. Humor masking dread. But not all was satire. One group, calling themselves the Ghost Trackers, claimed to have intercepted a faint microwave burst, beamed directly from the silent observatory toward a classified satellite network. The burst, when decrypted, contained only one phrase repeated 3 times. Anomaly persists. If true, then the facility had spoken, not to the public, but to someone else, someone listening. The mythology of the silent observatory quickly merged with the Atlas saga. Forums speculated that the facility was never built to serve humanity, but to monitor Atlas specifically, that its silence was not negligence, but mission. Perhaps some argued Atlas had been tracked for decades, even centuries. Its return cycle anticipated, its anomalies cataloged in databases we will never see. The observatory was not watching for the first time, it was waiting for the next recurrence. Be shown inside the myth, new layers of unease formed. If the silent observatory captured images of an object darker than space, bending starlight like water around a stone, then Atlas was not simply a comet. It was a device, a presence, equipped with the physics of concealment. The fractured mirror, the vanish, the return, all consistent with manipulation of visibility. And the observatory's silence? Perhaps not fear, perhaps respect, as though staring too long at Atlas carried consequences. A priest astronomer, writing anonymously in late July, drew a chilling connection. The silence of the observatory is the silence of the church centuries ago. Both are keepers of mysteries that unravel faith. The telescope has become a confessional. What they see, they cannot admit. The metaphor struck a nerve. The observatory is a modern cathedral, not of worship, but of observation. And like a cathedral, its silence was not absence, it was liturgy. By August, the silent observatory had become a cultural fault line. Some called for governments to force disclosure, to demand transparency from the facility. Others warned against it, invoking the dark forest hypothesis. What if the observatory was silent not for us, but for them? What if its silence is protection? The debate mirrored the divide of belief, now crystallized around a single building in the Andes. Meanwhile, amateurs kept scanning, filling the void left by institutional muteness. But the fact remained. Their instruments were fragile, their data patchy. The observatory, with its massive mirrors and classified feeds, likely knew more than the world could guess, and it had chosen silence. And perhaps the silence is the message. Perhaps the empty frames are not lies, but warnings, that sometimes in the forest, the safest thing is not to show what you see. And so the silent observatory looms over the Atlas story like a dark dome against the stars. Not an absence, but a presence of silence. A presence that forces us to ask, what did they see, and why will they not let us see it too? Because when the sky whispers, silence is not ignorance, silence is decision. By September 2021, the story of Atlas had shifted once again, not toward what was seen, but toward what was missing. It was no longer the flickering scar, the forbidden equation, or even the return window that dominated whispers. It was the gaps, the blank spaces, the silences threaded so precisely through data and archives that they began to look less like voids and more like script. Some called it paranoia, others called it pattern recognition. But in forum after forum, the same realization surfaced. Absence itself can be language. And the first discussion began with a database engineer in Canada who compared public star surveys across years. He noticed that in the months surrounding Atlas's vanishing point, the usual cadence of uploads, tens of thousands of images per night, suddenly fractured. Entire days missing, files misnumbered as though frames had been excised. When he graphed the intervals of absence, they were not random. They formed a repeating rhythm. Long gap, short gap, long gap, long gap. The same cadence reported in Atlas's shadow signal. Coincidence? Or silence speaking in pulses? The idea caught fire. Astronomers, amateur and professional, began revisiting their own data archives. Many noticed similar anomalies. Missing calibration logs, nights with unexplained outages, gaps that aligned eerily with key Atlas events. When the last transmission was reported in March, several observatories later admitted their systems had maintenance windows on the same night, windows that conveniently erased any possibility of confirmation. The pattern was too consistent. Maintenance was no longer an excuse. It was a mask. Then came the documents. A scholar of medieval manuscripts posted a scan of a 16th century text that described a torch that spoke by being absent, by blotting stars from the heavens, by erasing light as a quill erases ink. The metaphor had always been read as poetic. Now it sounded like testimony. A philosopher in Argentina took it further. He argued that absence has always been the first language of power. What is censorship? He wrote, if not the deliberate erasure of words? What is silence, if not the sharpest answer? If Atlas was indeed a messenger, perhaps its message was not in light, but in absence. Not in what it showed us, but in what it took away. In late September, a chilling leak reinforced this suspicion. A partial transcript from a private ESA call circulated on encrypted forums. In it, an unnamed researcher said, "The absences align. They are structured. We are no longer analyzing an object. We are analyzing an editor. An editor. A hand unseen, cutting frames, erasing data, curating perception. Whether cosmic or institutional, the result was the same. Knowledge filtered, truth absent by design." Just the believers embraced this with fervor. They mapped the absences like cartographers, drawing constellations from the voids. Some began treating the gaps themselves as scripture. One group even published a codex of silence, translating the missing intervals into binary, then into letters. Their text was cryptic, full of fragments. Not yet. Wait. Return. Many dismissed it as fantasy, but for those desperate to make sense of absence, it became gospel. Skeptics pushed back. Absences, they argued, happen in any dataset. Clouds cover skies, servers fail, manuscripts rot. But even skeptics struggled with the consistency. Clouds do not align across continents. Servers do not fail in rhythms. Manuscripts do not erase the same metaphors century after century. And silence does not arrive precisely when anomalies demand noise. The skeptics fell quiet, and silence once again became louder than words. Now consider the implications. If absence is deliberate, then every gap is a decision. Every missing frame is a withheld sentence. Every erased manuscript is a torn page from a story someone doesn't want us to finish. And if that is true, then we are not passive readers of the sky. We are participants in a conversation written partly in light, partly in absence. A haunting anecdote spread in October. A Chilean amateur reported capturing Atlas's faint pulse one night, only to discover the next morning that his laptop had corrupted every frame except the ones before and after. He was devastated until he noticed something chilling. The missing frames numbered exactly 37, the same number as the unknown constant in the forbidden equation, x37, too precise to dismiss, too convenient to ignore. He wrote, "It is not my hardware. It is a hand pulling threads from the fabric. I am only left holding the holes." The Vatican surfaced again, this time in rumor only. A monk reportedly claimed that in their archives, absence was the true mark of significance. The most dangerous texts were not the ones preserved, but the ones missing. The torn page, he allegedly said, is louder than the written one. And so the concept of a language of absence took root. For some it was cosmic, Atlas itself erasing light, carving silence, teaching through gaps. For others, it was human, institutions cutting, scrubbing, choosing. For most, it was both, a collusion between messenger and keeper, silence passed back and forth like a secret code. If this is true, then our greatest mistake may be in ignoring what is missing. We stare at the scars, the transmissions, the equations, when the truest anomaly may be the absences that frame them. Like negative space in art, the meaning lies in what is not there. So I ask you, what has been erased from your sight? What was in the frame that's now gone? What story hides not in light, but in the void between? Because in a universe that may speak through silence, absence is not ignorance. It is language. And the question is, do you know how to read it? By November 2021, the watchers had grown weary. Months of searching, decoding, and chasing faint anomalies had left them restless, caught between revelation and exhaustion. Atlas had returned, yes, but it had returned altered, its scar faint, its orbit bent, its pulse weaker. The forbidden equation lingered in datasets. The absences in archives still gaped like missing teeth. The silent observatory remained mute. And then, abruptly, everything stopped. On the night of November 12th, Atlas fell silent. The forgotten light, once faintly pulsing, vanished entirely. The shadow signal that had haunted radio bands for months flattened into static. Even the absences, those eerie gaps in databases, ceased to align. For the first time since January, there was nothing. Not silence heavy with weight, not absences threaded with pattern, but a silence absolute. To some, this was relief. The storm had passed, the comet was gone, the anomalies had ended. But for others, the silence was the loudest anomaly yet, because patterns do not collapse into nothing without reason, and messages do not end without conclusion. More in the community called it the final silence. Amateurs reacted with disbelief. They continued scanning night after night, desperate for a flicker, a pulse, a whisper. Nothing came. Some accused institutions of jamming, of interference campaigns designed to sever the public's connection to the anomaly. Others feared something far worse, that the silence was not ours, but Atlas's choice. A chilling post appeared on November 15th from a known leaker tied to ESA. It read simply, "The corridor is closed. The window has ended. Return interval classified." The words ignited panic. If the return window had truly closed, then Atlas's silence was not random, it was cyclical. This was not the end, but the pause before another cycle. And if the cycle was measured not in months, but in centuries, then our glimpse had been fleeting, a stolen moment in a story too large for human time. And the believers clung to this. They argued that the final silence was part of the pattern, that absence itself was a message. Just as the scar spoke, just as the equation whispered, just as the archives withheld, the silence was not nothing. It was instruction, a warning to wait. A priest in Mexico described it as divine. The voice stopped, not because it is gone, but because we have heard enough. Revelation does not last forever. The silence is the seal. Others feared darker possibilities. Some suggested that Atlas's silence meant it had completed its task, that the scar was not just a wound but a recording, that the forbidden equation was not a gift but a test, and that having measured our response, Atlas had withdrawn, not out of mercy, but because it had no reason to remain. What if Atlas was never meant to stay? What if its purpose was simply to listen? And what if it now carried our answers, our noise, our eagerness, our failure at silence, back into the forest? The dark forest hypothesis hung heavier than ever. In forums, posts repeated the same haunting phrase, "The forest knows now." No institutions, as always, denied nothing and admitted nothing. NASA released no final update. ESA issued no obituary for Atlas. The Vatican made no mention. But silence by then had become familiar. Silence was itself the confirmation. In December, an amateur from Chile uploaded his final log. He had been scanning nightly since April, cataloging every flicker, every absence. On December 3rd he wrote, "Nothing, only stars. The scar's gone, the light is gone, the rhythm is gone, but the feeling remains. The feeling that something has ended and something else has begun." His final line resonated across the community. "The silence is heavier than the voice ever was." The final silence was not an event. It was an atmosphere, a weight pressing on everyone who had followed the story. For some, it brought closure. For others, it left a wound deeper than Atlas's scar. Because silence is not proof, but it is unforgettable. Once you have heard the cosmos whisper, silence is never the same again. The mythology grew in absence. Some said the final silence was like a curtain closing on an act we were never meant to witness. Others compared it to a test abruptly ended by the examiner. A few treated it as prophecy fulfilled. The torch had spoken, the numbers had been given, the scar had been healed, and now the sky returned to its inscrutable stillness. But for many, the silence was unbearable. The community fractured. Some walked away, exhausted. unwilling to chase whispers into eternity. Others doubled down, convinced the next cycle could be predicted, calculated, awaited, and some, quietly, dangerously, argued that silence must be broken, that if Atlas refused to speak, humanity should answer instead, transmit, send our own signal into the void. That is where fear sharpened. Because in the dark forest, noise is danger. And the final silence may not have been absence at all. It may have been waiting, waiting for us to speak, to reveal ourselves, to break the code of silence that has kept civilizations hidden for eons. Perhaps the most chilling line came from an anonymous post in early 2022. The final silence is not the end. It is the pause before reply. During Kinjin Bir Bari and so we are left here, suspended between awe and dread. Atlas is gone, its scar is memory. Its forbidden equation lingers in our files. Its absences haunt our databases. But its silence, that heavy, absolute silence, remains the truest anomaly of all. Because silence is not nothing. Silence is choice. Silence is language. Silence is the weight of something too large to speak. So ask yourself, is the final silence a mercy or a warning? Is it the closing of a door or the intake of breath before the knock returns? We will not know until the cycle turns again, until the scar reappears, until the numbers whisper once more. And when that day comes, will we still be listening? Or will the silence have already spoken louder than we ever could?